My name is Santi. I will do a presentation about anarchists in Russia and anti-war movement, like movement against war in Ukraine. But I have to make a disclaimer that I'm not talking in behalf of Ukrainian anarchists. I don't know so much about the Ukrainian anarchist movement. I know about the Russian anarchist movement because I was living 13 years in Russia. But then I was deported 10 years ago, but I'm still involved in some projects with Russian anarchists and anti-authoritarians. But also I must say that it's currently the anti-war movement in Russia in general. It's not yet even close to stop the war. So there is often, this war has some difficult political questions in terms of kind of anti-militarist position and anti-authoritarian position, like how we can be one of the sides of the wars, because obviously in both of the sides there is all the kinds of people who are basically not close to us at all. But then, so it would be easy to say that, okay, we are just for the anti-war movement and we have to stop the war, like just make anti-war agitation so that people will stop going to the front. But historically, this is something that usually almost never happens. Wars usually finished by waging the war, and it's only like a couple of cases that anti-war movement have actually managed to stop the war. This is like First World War is one of them in the final phase, but not so many others. And even more, it's even more unusual that the war which has been going more or less well, has been stopped by the people. Usually there has to be some sort of setbacks and prolongation of the war until enough people are protesting against it. But it's obviously like common position of anarchists in Russia that all anarchists in Russia wish for Russian defeat. And my personal position is that I hope that Ukraine doesn't lose either, that they get at least the same situation as before this February, because otherwise this can be some sort of propaganda victory for Putin and Putin's regime. But there is also some anarchists in Russia. They hope that both of the sides win, but no one is hoping that Russia would win this war. No one thinks this is some sort of anti-fascist denazification war. This is obvious to everyone. And also in this presentation, I cannot go so deep to the origins of the war and what happened in 2014 and this Maidan things. But just in the beginning, I have to say that the war already started in 2014, and there was 1 year of intense operations. And then since 2015, the spring, there has been less intense war and less intense operations. But there has not been any point that there has actually been peace in this area. So, but first I go a bit about these Russian propaganda claims. I don't know how familiar this is. Maybe you come across this discussion with some kind of leftists. And first of the Russian propaganda claim is that Ukraine is governed by the Nazis. But here we can take there is basically two propositions which don't necessarily contradict each other. So you can say that, okay, Ukraine has a strong fascist and Nazi movement, relatively strong. They are, because Ukraine is a big country, they have 40 million people, so even if 1 out of 1,000 is fascist, there is still 40,000 fascists, which is a lot. But also, you can also claim that fascists and Nazis have no influence in Ukrainian politics. And these don't contradict each other, because there can be a big fascist movement which is still not about to take over the country. And there was definitely many people had this fear in 2014, because the Ukrainian army was very unprepared to the war, and in the operations they were, and not the centralized state didn't really manage in many areas to organize good defense. So the war was, especially in the first months, it was waged by these voluntary battalions, which were in many cases organized by the far-right activists. But then far-right activists were not able to use this, and they also, of course, got lots of kind of positive coverage, and these voluntary militias were respected in the society, and lots of people joined these movements. But they didn't really manage to use this for their benefit. And in the elections, far-right didn't do very well. There was more or less like far-right and fascist coalition. They only got 2% of the votes. They didn't go past the election barrier. They had maybe one deputy, because there are some deputies which get there if they get most of the votes in their area, but they didn't get the list didn't get to the parliament. But also another like more populist far-right party also didn't pass this barrier. So in the parliamentary politics, the far-right is doing pretty badly. And there was also I did this talk in Porto 1 week ago, and there was someone asked, so but how can you say that how can you measure like this the far-right influence? Because of course anarchists are also who don't participate in parliament, doesn't mean that anarchists would never have any influence. But this is also like difference between fascist movements and kind of grassroots movements, because fascists, they are not really a grassroots movement. They want political power, and they can have this by two means, either by some political violence or by going to elections. But both of these failed in Ukraine, and they didn't even dare so much to try to proceed with the political violence. They were attacking like some pride demonstration and anti-fascist events, but they didn't get so much done with this, and it was quite widely condemned, this kind of action. So they tried to go to parliamentary politics, and they failed to do this. Fascists are not organizing strikes or some mass movements. It's not something that they are doing. So they tried to get the political power, and they didn't manage to do this. And also Russia, of course, it doesn't have less fascist than Ukraine, probably even more. Now Russian kind of fascism, which is not independent from Kremlin, it's kind of crushed in Russia and more or less underground, but it's still happening. I will also talk about this later. But fascist, which is kind of supporting Putin and Kremlin, it's very strong, and also there are these kind of fascist units now waging war in Ukraine, even with some armbands and swastikas and this kind of stuff. So this whole issue that this is kind of denazification war, it's kind of ridiculous to claim this. And also second, Putin propaganda claim is that there is a genocide of Russian people in Donbass. There is, mistake should be big here, it's a typo. And yeah, it's true that in the 8 years there has been some shooting and sometimes fighting happening in this area. And also civilians have been dying, but there has been less and less civilians dying. So in the first 3 years of this war, according to the United Nations, it was more than 3,000 civilians died. And this is in the both sides, both in the Ukrainian side and in the side of the so-called People's Republics. I don't know the splitting how much in the Disgraça side, and sometimes you don't even know, because basically it can be the front line, can be in the middle of some village. So someone can die, your neighbor is dying, and then it's kind of Ukrainian civilian, but then in the other side of the street, someone dies, and then it's a separatist. But this is also a big pointless division, because before the war, this was all the same people. All of these people are basically Ukrainian citizens, and almost everyone is a Russian speaker. They're in these areas. So then during the next 4 years, it was altogether 149 deaths. And then of the last year, 2021, I only have the statistics of the separatists themselves. but they say that 8 people died in the shooting. So every year there has been lots of less and less shootings of civilian areas. Also, who is shooting, this is difficult to say, because if you go to Ukrainian side, they say that, okay, this separatist always shooting and we are just sometimes answering, and if some civilian dies, it's just a propaganda. And of course, the separatists are saying the same. I was there 5 years ago in this frontline area. Basically, it happens that, okay, there is you hear that there is shooting from Ukrainian side, and then after a few hours they are answering, shooting some grenades back. But you don't know who started, because of course it's always revenge of revenge, and then revenge of revenge of revenge. And it goes back like 8 years, so you cannot really say that, okay, these people broke the ceasefire, because always other side broke the ceasefire the day before, and then the other side broke the ceasefire 2 days ago. So it's not so easy to say that who is actually to blame this continuous shooting, but it's the fact that it's much less people dying each year, and what is actually a genocide. This is even kind of problematic concept in general, because it's 8 people if they die. Is it a genocide, or is one person dying a genocide? Maybe it is, because there is no any this international law. There is no any clear definition what is the genocide. But if 8 people dying in the separatist territory last year, it's a genocide, and obviously like 1,000 Ukrainian civilians who have died this year is also genocide. So is it like would they also answer to this genocide with 100 times bigger genocide? They would not. But yeah, it's obviously it's always a war crime to shoot civilian territory, and this is obviously something that both parts have been doing all of these years. But is it a genocide? It's maybe not, and also is it like justified to start this kind of huge war of this kind of thing? It's also kind of a question. Then also this discussion, what about NATO and NATO influence? And this is kind of also comes back to how we generally understand like things like imperialism and colonialism and so on. Because okay, you can say that NATO is alliance of these old imperialist powers, and USA is doing all the kinds of shitty things in the Middle East, and France is also have their own stuff that they do in Africa, in many countries. But Europe is still slightly different, because in Europe, these countries, Eastern European countries, there is usually some referendum, and then they join to NATO by support of the majority. So of course you can say that these people are brainwashed by liberal propaganda, but this is not really how colonialism is traditionally understood or happening. Usually colonialism, traditionally it's that some country is attacking some other country and occupying them, the people become slaves, or at least second-class citizens, and taking away all their land or something. This is obviously something that is not happening in Estonia. Like there is no French and Americans going there and taking people's land and making them work for them and so on. So I think this should, of course, you can say that there is neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism, which is different, but it doesn't look like this Russian attack in Ukraine, and also it's a bit problematic to have this kind of inflation of concepts that saying that whatever kind of political lobbying or international cooperation or even propaganda is imperialism. And also we cannot, like NATO was spreading to many countries, or many countries joined to NATO, also former Soviet Union countries, but we don't see this war happening currently in Estonia, for example, and or Finland, which is now discussing about joining NATO and already put NATO membership application. And the difference is that Ukraine is in this current Kremlin ideology, Ukrainians are not considered to be real people. They are considered that they are kind of Russians who, because of some Nazi propaganda, think that they are not Russians, and they kind of had to be cured from this Nazi brainwashing by brutal violence and occupation and repression. And basically the reason behind this invasion is not NATO expansion, but it's the Russian ultra-nationalist ideas. It's this idea that all the places where Russia is spoken, like which is Russian first language speakers majority, they should be in the same country. And half of the Ukrainian is basically Russian speaker majority, and another half it's people speak Ukrainian, but also Putin maybe doesn't think. If he had a chance, he would probably occupy the whole Ukraine because he also probably doesn't consider Ukrainian language his language. And also, usually leftists, they often go to kind of very vulgar and crude Marxist idea to find a profit motivations everywhere and raw materials and land. And it's true that Ukraine has the best agricultural land in the world. It's this so-called black ground. Also, it's in southern Russia and Ukraine, which is the most fertile land that is in this planet. And even if agriculture is not currently so profitable, it will obviously be very profitable in the future. But this war is so expensive and it causes so much destruction that this will not be profitable for the Russian state for maybe 50 or 100 years. And we don't know what happens in 50 and 100 years, and capitalists, they are not so interested about profits sometime after their death. So it's a very, when they have died, then their children also have died. So capitalism is always about some destruction for the sake of short-term profits. So you can obviously, like all the war, are somehow also caused by the capitalism, because capitalism is basically forcing everyone to compete, and it's creating its ideology of competition without caring about the consequences. So capitalism is against all the kind of solidarity between workers and solidarity between people in general. But this is kind of very kind of long stretch connection and very kind of high level reason behind this war. But you cannot really find any short-term profit motivation in this war. No one is. There can be some individual military businesses in Russia, for example, which are making profit, but most of the Russian capitalists are losing huge amount of money, and Putin also, like as you maybe know, Putin formally doesn't have much property, but all of his former friends and relatives and children from marriage and out of wedlock, all of them are billionaires. But because they stole so much common assets, and then they keep them in some tax havens. But all of this property value has dropped a lot because of this war, and will drop, and maybe will not gain back the value during their lifetime. So they are not. These people are greedy, but they are not getting more rich because of this war. It has some sort of other motivation, and it's kind of ultra-nationalist motivation. I could also discuss why kind of Russia is stepped out from this kind of liberal capitalist ideology to another kind of capitalist ideology, because obviously this Russian system is still a capitalism, but it's not capitalist. The billionaires are deciding. The billionaires, some of the billionaires actually have now escaped Russia. And also Abramovich tried to make this kind of futile attempt to negotiate, but he was poisoned by someone, we don't know whom, but probably some Russian faction. So, and after this, Abramovich, it obviously shows that Abramovich is not the guy who is deciding. in Russian and this war is not something like it's obviously he's not a good person in any way, but it's not someone who is behind this war. And the ruling class in Russia is not the capitalists, but it's the security officials Putin comes from the KGB, and everyone who is in the highest position, they usually have mostly they have a KGB background, or they are some friends of Putin from his childhood or studies, or when he began his career. Also, some people maybe have army or police background, but the security services are most important. So, but anyway, it's a long discussion what's basically the Russian political structure and how this kind of ultranationalism became important to maintain this kind of mafia kind of structures. But yeah, we can maybe discuss this later if we have time. So then the last general discussion. This is more maybe inside the anarchist circles. So what about opposing to both sides? And here I would also need a definition of imperialism in context of this talk. Is that imperialism is when a state pursues the conquest of some other territories and reach the status of leading superpower. And I made this kind of definition to make clear distinction that we have to discuss separately from stuff that is this kind of very brutal assaults against other countries, which is imperialism, and then some sort of more subtle things, like, for example, spreading of McDonald's or some structural adjustments, loans, or this kind of. It can be also the problem that some cultures are disappearing, obviously, but it's not the same thing that to attack another country and to destroy physically everything there. This cannot be really discussed in the same context. And if we have the problem with some sort of very sloppy imperialism, the discussion that then anything can be imperialism. If Ukrainians don't want to be occupied by Russia but want to join NATO, for example, this is like NATO imperialism. So then, like everything can be imperialism, like imperialism can be justified, or maybe if you have a very sloppy definition of imperialism, then suddenly Putin is anti-imperialist because he's fighting against the United States. Or maybe China is anti-imperialist because the Uyghurs or Tibetans, they are actually imperialist because they want to separate from China because they have been used soft imperialism by the United States or something like this. Like, obviously, you can have a liberal ideology or United States money from many places in academic communities or whatever, like all the money from the world is circulating, and lots of this obviously is coming from the United States. But and this can be criticized also, like and discussed on stuff like academic independence, but you cannot really compare this of Russia attacking Ukraine and killing thousands of people there. And Ukraine, on the other hand, is not about to conquer anything. So obviously Ukraine is not imperialist, but at least in this definition. There might be another problems related to Ukrainian ultra-nationalism, because there is, like I said, there's nationalist tendencies in Ukraine, even though they are not maybe bigger than in many other European countries, and also there was like fascist street violence also in Ukraine because this country is not so, organized. Then the police force often doesn't have either interests or resources to stop different kinds of organized criminal groups. But currently it doesn't seem that this Ukrainian nationalism is becoming some sort of threat. Like theoretically, of course, if Russia completely collapses and splits to different parts, and Ukraine gets lots of weapons that they can, for example, attack Crimea and take it back, which is kind of problem because it might be that majority of the people in Crimea don't really want back to Ukraine, or they maybe would be fine to join in Ukraine like it was 10 years ago, but they are not so much interested to join Ukraine where Russian language has no official status and you cannot study in Russian language in all the school teaching is in Ukrainian, which is reforms that have happened after 2014. There is a group in Crimea, the Crimean Tatars, who have been living there much longer than many Russians or Ukrainians. They are less than 50% part of the population because they were suffering many genocides during the last 200 years, first under the Tsar and then during the Stalin years. They are identify themselves as Ukraine and they are resisting the Crimean occupation and usually non-violently. They have lots of political prisoners. And it's true that these people are kind of more original people there. They were never given back the lands after all of these deportations and genocides, so they are still kind of second-class citizens, just with some small lands they managed to buy with their own money, but everything that they owned before the genocide is still confiscated from them. So obviously there is an argument that basically these people should have more to say about the crime, but also they are a minority. There now, after all of the genocides, most of the people there are like vast majority of is Russian speakers, probably more than maybe half of the people might identify with Russia. The support of Crimea joining Russia, it has changed. It has been different in different times. Sometimes it has been quite a small part, sometimes a bigger part. But also this war has increased the tensions, and that might be that people who were before more interested to live in Ukraine, they are now more identified as Russian. Also people who basically were against Russian occupation, they have been forced to escape from Crimea. So basically most of the people who are still living there, they are more or less kind of like at least more or less fine with the situation to the extent that they continue to live there, and they remember that also they just want to keep their lands. If they know that if they go away, they can never come back. So, but still, probably I would say that it's likely that most of the people there would like to have a huge war there and destruction, even if they are maybe not so happy with the Russian rule. But this is a very also theoretical perspective. Like currently, Ukraine doesn't have resources to even to take back these areas which were recently occupied. In many cases, well, in some cases they have managed, but there is still huge territory which they haven't been getting. So it doesn't seem very likely that in the very close future Ukraine could, for example, attack Ukraine or something. And then, but still, I mean, this Ukrainian internationalism is kind of a theoretical and distant future possible problem. Then, anarchists in many cases, they were during the wars, they were propagating like not going to war and to deserting. But it's a problem that if everyone, okay. Yeah, so anarchists had this, been doing, especially during the First World War, but also, for example, Vietnam War, that you should go to war, you should desert. And they desert and not refuse to join the army, which would of course be a good solution in the Russian side. In the Ukrainian side is the problem that if everyone deserts in Ukraine, then Russia will take over Ukraine, and then they can go to Poland, and they can take, if everyone is deserting to Germany, then they take Poland, and then they can take Germany. And then France, and eventually everyone is just in Portugal waiting for Russia to come there. So the problem with the desertion is that it's at some point the imperialists should be stopped. So if you desert, someone else has to do it. And even if Ukrainian anarchists were not very much wanted to join this resistance, it still would be discredit the whole anarchist movement if they didn't do anything while the society is being destroyed. So it's kind of something, even if they are not feeling very patriotic, they don't really have much other opportunity if they want to keep their movement existing after this war. Like there is some also we discussed in Porto that but what's the use in this? Like, and there is like different opinions on this. Like some Ukrainian anarchists, they are positive that when they get this experience of organizing this territorial defense, it can be also used in the future and against the Ukrainian state as well. But some are maybe not so positive. It might be that that nothing so much comes out. Like basically, it is just the best thing that can happen is just to get back to the situation that before the war. But actually, most positive people or most optimistic are mostly, especially in the beginning of the war, they were the Russian anarchists, because for Russian anarchists, this is maybe the last chance to ever to get rid of Putin before he just dies. Because if he wins now, his position will be so strong that he will be in the power basically until he dies. And if he lives as long as Mugabe, it can be like 30 years still in the power, because he is not wants to go anywhere. So yeah, there are some anarchists in Russia who said that okay, we are against both armies, but no one is supporting the Russian army. So then I go a bit to tell about Antifa and anarchists in Russia. So last 10 years there has been kind of decline of importance of anarchists and especially Antifa in Russia. What happened to Antifa is that it basically became less relevant because the fascist violence has been dropping a lot in Russia. The Nazi problem has become smaller for various reasons. Partially it's a result of the anti-fascist activities, but also pretty much a result of the police repression, but also a result of the war, because Russian fascists were very heavily skewed with the war. Some Russian Nazis were supporting Ukraine because they consider that it's more like nation state, and Russia is multinational state, so they were supporting Ukraine, and some other fascists were supporting Russia, so they were fighting between themselves after 2014. But basically, yeah, it's the thing that if anti-fascists are kind of successful, then they also they're kind of, how to say, important in the society declines. If you kind of fill your purpose, you don't have so much to do. But also anti-fascists were also heavily repressed, and many activists had to escape Russia, or they went to prison. Also, there are different people in the anti-fascist movement in Russia. Not everyone is anti-authoritarian. There is also people who are more like Leninists, and people who are just patriot, anti-Nazis, and so on. And some of these people actually then were supporting the war or Crimean occupation and the separatist republic. It was not many people, but still there was some internal conflicts also because of these things. And with anarchists, this was never a problem. It was very few anarchists who had any sympathies with the separatist movement, but this kind of Marxist or Leninist anti-fascist, it was sometimes a problem. But also anarchists have problems to adapt to new circumstances, because, for example, the movement where I was involved, autonomous action, it was always pretty much the strategy was to be like campaigns and street actions, and to be in the street and to join different protest movements. But then gradually all the protests have been made impossible in Russia. And at first, it was more and more difficult to get any permissions to demonstrate. Like legally, you are not required to ask a permission, but in practice, police is demanding it and they arrest you. And then with the COVID, all the demonstrations were banned, and actually in Russia, already after like 2 or 3 months, most of the COVID restrictions they were lifted. but all the demonstrations are still banned. So this is just a pretext to repress any kind of movement. So this kind of anti-vax conspiracy theory that COVID is basically just a plot to create a fascist system, it's actually happened in Russia. So it's not a conspiracy theory, it's true in some places. So yeah, and also, but you would think that if there is more repression, actually people start to be more interested about more radical stuff. But what happened in Russia was actually the opposite. Like when there was more and more repressions, people started to hope more and more that they would go to elections and to change something in elections, or maybe make some petition campaigns or this kind of thing. Like the whole opposition in Russia during the last 10 years, it kind of gets more and more moderate. And also Navalny movement, for example, like until he was imprisoned last year, and Alexei Navalny was the most important opposition politician in Russia. But why he was so popular? He was because at first he was very good tactician. His strategy was to fight against corruption, and this is something that everyone is against, right? Both leftist and rightist and centrist and whoever, no one likes the corruption, so this is that you can do it everyone. And also he proposed very simple solutions. He said that, okay, I make this video on YouTube, send it to your friends, this will change the regime. And also, okay, we try to go to elections, but we were banned from elections, so you can vote some kind of party which is not the Putin's party, but some loyalist party of the Putin, like Communist Party, for example, which is basically also a Kremlin puppet party. Now Navalny was proposing that you can vote for this, and then it maybe changes something, but of course it didn't change anything. He's in prison because he also had to have his show until the end. Like he had this idea that Russia is like a normal country where you can do normal politics, but it didn't have that. But so maybe, and it's difficult to say if this will now change, but this kind of very how to say, criticizing not only corruption but the whole state and capitalism and so on, it got more and more marginalized in Russia. And also there was some heavy repression. For example, there was the case of so-called networks case in St. Petersburg and Penza. There were people arrested in 2017 and tortured very heavily. Everyone confessed first that they were members of some terrorist organization, even though there was no any terrorist plan or not even any kind of structure. Many of these people didn't even know each other directly. They were just friends of friends of friends. But with this kind of heavy torture, they confessed everything. Then after the public campaigning, the torture was stopped. And when they went to court, like almost everyone were refusing this confession. But in Russia, it doesn't really matter so much. If you give a confess testimony at some point, it's not cancelled, and unless you manage to prove in court that you were tortured and so on, which is quite difficult. But this was basically not some low-level FSB plot. The whole thing was planned in quite high level of the FSB, and all the sentences were also decided beforehand. So it was not really possible to avoid. So all of these people got prison sentences for up to 18 years in prison. And basically, they were radical anarchists. They were discussing in theory how to maybe in some sort of distant future we should do some underground armed activity against the regime. But it was very far from any kind of practical plans. But this was kind of big demoralizing thing for the anarchist movement, because pretty much most of the anarchists, even with all these disagreements and disappointments and hating each other, they were participating in different ways to the support campaign, but it didn't. Like only victory was that the torture was stopped, but the sentences just came like it was decided. No one could influence them. Then Another case was Azov Miftahov. This was also around the same time. during the 2018 in anti-repression, there was anti-repression protest in Moscow. It was organized by Anarchist Group for People's Self-Defense, and they broke some windows of the United Russia Party in this demonstration. And after this, there was a big repression. Many people also had to escape from Russia. And Azatnikov was arrested. He is a mathematician, and eventually he was also put to prison for 6 years just for breaking something during the demonstration. So this was also a big kind of alarm to anarchists, because these kind of things was possible to do like 10 years ago. Like you can have a demonstration and do some graffiti and break some windows, and probably not much will happen. But now the situation is different, and this kind of thing is very heavily repressed. So the situation definitely has changed. But so we go to the. Okay, I actually have to do one technical thing now quickly. Yeah, so then we finally go to the anti-war movements. This was all just an intro. So, yeah, during the first week of war, there were big protests. This is a picture from St. Petersburg. There were occasionally the protesters could control the city center. In Moscow, it was not like this. In Moscow, it was all the time so much police. Or actually the National Guard, which is the Russian Red Police, that they were just breaking all the bigger groups and people were just running around the city. In St. Petersburg, they managed to gather really bigger groups, and altogether it was more than 15,000 people arrested in the protest in around 70 cities during the first 2 months of the protests. Most of these people didn't got any big sentence, they maybe got some fines. Or do you want to ask? No, they got some fines, but also some people got some criminal charges. And also in Russia there is the system that that there is kind of quick prison sentence that you may get if the court may sentence you to prison up to 30 days. And you can appeal this, but appeal gets more than 30 days, takes more than 30 days. So many people got this kind of short prison sentences. And also, if you get several times arrested or fined for illegal demonstration, then it might already be a felony case, and you may go to up to 2 years in prison. So even if most of these arrested people were immediately released, it's a big pressure against doing this very many times. So this is why this kind of demonstration stopped. There were also lots of different petitions. Some of them got more than 1 million signatures online, and also different special groups, like for example, university directors petition. There was like more than 100 of university directors were petitioning against the war, and even like Orthodox priests, which are usually very conservative or loyal, in quite high level of the church hierarchy. So there were a higher level of much more protests against this than usual in the society, but it was still not enough to stop the war. And actually, during these first weeks, it was probably the majority of the people supporting the war. And actually yeah, in the first weeks it was like both, there were like state-controlled polling agencies and there were independent agencies. So with them, like between 58 or 71% were supporting this invasion. But also, even in this kind of state-sponsored polls, you can see a big kind of, I would say maybe like segregation or differences in different demographic groups. For example, people in the cities, they are much less supportive of the war than people in the countryside, and also younger people are much less supportive than older people. And the biggest actually indicator, which is the biggest statistical correlation, is if you're watching the television or not. Like most likely the people who watch the television, they are supporting the war, and people who don't, they are against it. Because in Russia there is already more than 20 years there has not been independent television channels which everyone could watch in the normal TV sets. There has been some cable private televisions, but they never been available for majority of the people. And it was put in strategy that okay, opposition can have internet, they can have papers, and they can have radio channels, but the television is on Kremlin, and it has been actually enough. And why basically after 20 years of internet, people still are watching television? It's a bit frustrating, but apparently that's the case. But still, like people who are less than 30 years and who don't watch the television, in them 80% are against the war, even according to Kremlin's own polling agencies. But also the polls are becoming very unreliable. More and more people just don't answer. This was one poll which is already in the April. It was like street polling, but it was not made by phone or internet, but in the street. But more than 60% refused to answer the questions, and then 15% were supporting the war. But then if you remove the 62%, then it becomes that actually almost half are supporting the war. So, but this poll, like probably of these people who refuse to answer, they are probably more against the war than supporting the war. So you cannot really currently even know what's basically the situation in the Russian society. Was mostly supporting the war during the first weeks or a couple of months, but what's happening now, no one really knows. So, different initiatives. There are like lots of because all of this, like Navalny organization and many old human rights organizations, they have been banned and destroyed, and they don't have any kind of clandestine alternative structures. So now there is dozens of different bigger or smaller anti-war initiatives. I cannot tell about all of them, but I think one of the most important is called feminist anti-war resistance, because like in many countries, also in Russia, the feminism has been growing strongly during the last 10 years, because it's very can be quite effective in using internet and social media. And these kind of new feminist groups, they are consolidated now in this feminist anti-war resistance network, which is kind of decentralized network. They have 34,000 subscribers in this Telegram channel. This is one of the few ways you can kind of measure how much it is, but it's also, of course, not reliable, because theoretically you can also put some robot to follow you in Telegram. And also your political opponents maybe follow you on Telegram, but it's some indicator how wide is the reach. Telegram is now the most important opposition social media in Russia, because in Russia they tried to ban Telegram already 5 years ago, but they managed to technologically evade by changing many IP addresses very quickly. So they kind of managed to evade this ban. And this cause of decentralized protest, they spread to 78 different cities, and they have like photo record. It is not just a claim, but it can be shown. It's made of different initiatives who are organizing kind of street action. This is the most important, but it's not maybe even street action. I just can call them like streets in the Twitter marks, more like outdoor actions, because this is an example. This is why you are reading this. Children are dying in Ukraine, and then there is some teddy bear in blood and so on. And this is just put to some public park. so that people can see it there. So it's not even that people are gathering somewhere in the street to do a demonstration, but it's this kind of how to say, diffusing art to different places and parks and yards and houses and so on. And one of the groups which is behind it is a feminist group called 8 Initiative Group in St. Petersburg. It's been around already maybe 3 or 4 years. But they were targeted with this criminal case that the special services were claiming that they were organizing bomb hoax calls. So also lots of people are now facing these charges of organizing this fake criminal case of organizing some form of terrorism. And some of them had to escape from Russia. Then also, there are different initiatives to support soldiers, conscripts, students and workers who are facing problems because of their anti-war activities. And the students and conscripts, they are kind of connected because there is a conscription in Russia, but most of the people may avoid the military. But for instance, for example, if you go to university, you are exempt from the army during your studies. But the conscription age ends at 27 years, so if you study until you are 25, then you just have to avoid the call-up for 2 more years, and then you are out. But if you don't go to university, then you have to hide 10 years, which is much more. But yeah, so kind of spreading information how to avoid the conscription, it's important to spread among the students, and lots of kind of alternative or independent student activists were involved in this. And there is also movement for conscientious subject learning. There is initiative called Call of Consciousness. I don't know if it's a good translation, but it's kind of legal supported how to avoid the army. And the interesting thing right now in Russia is that as far as there is no declaration of war and there is no general mobilizations, it's not actually obligatory to go to war. Even if you are a contract soldier, that you get a salary. You can like sign a paper that, okay, I refuse my contract, or I keep my contract but I don't go to war. And there are actually cases that people have managed to do this. And also how to avoid, if you are a conscript, how to avoid going to army, there is kind of SEMA, how you can navigate in this bureaucracy by making different kind of letters and claims and complaints, and how you can basically legally avoid going to army. Sometimes, of course, there can be lots of pressure, and not maybe even practice possible to use these legal opportunities, but some of the people manage to do this. This might change if there is at some point like general mobilization or declaration of war, then of course conscripts will have much less rights. So there is initiative Students Against War, and also there is this, this actually slide is not really visible. Anti-job net is old anarchist initiative, it's already existed for 20 years. In the peacetime, it functioned more like a blacklist of employers, that if you have problems with your salary or work condition, you can write there, and then people can find this information and they don't have a job for the same place. It's also a very popular website and probably the most popular anarchist website, even if it was kind of this narrow focus. But now during the war, it's a new problem that people who refuse to spread propaganda in their workplaces. They are also facing this repression, and the anti-job is organizing like legal support. There is now some financing. There will be consultation and legal support for example, teachers who are kicked out of their jobs because they are refusing to spread anti-war propaganda. And even teachers in the kindergarten might have these problems because even to small children, sometimes they want to do some brainwashing. This is not visible, but there is also an initiative called anti-war sick leave. In the first weeks of the war, there was a that okay, you can just call sick and you don't go to work, and this is kind of the like opposition. against the war. So there is this kind of like different initiatives and ideas. And then also one, which is a new kind of really studying also different movements of these national minorities and indigenous people movements, that it's been now growing heavily because of this war. Of course, it means turn towards this ultranationalism. Previously, especially when there was a strong ultra-right movement in Russia, for Kremlin propaganda it was important to stress that we are a multinational country. It was like, okay, the Russians are the most important, but everyone else is also important. But now it's been turning more towards this kind of general Russian chauvinism, and it obviously results counter-reaction, because Russia is a multinational country and there are areas in Russia where ethnic Russians are actually minority. And these areas are also presented, like overrepresented in the casualties, because they are often the more poor regions. So, for example, there is, I think I read today that already more than 200 people are confirmed dead from Buryatia, which is one of the Siberian republics. People, they are one of the Mongol groups. So it's a poor region, people don't have so much chances. The contract soldiers, they get several times average salary. So people try to use this opportunity, but now there is very big casualty rates, so they just don't come back. So there are different initiatives like Free Nogari, Foundation, Nations of Russia. These are kind of creating anti-colonialist critics of Russian imperialism, and also organizing some anti-war protests in these minority nationality communities. It's not like very strong, but also in general the anti-war movement and feminist movement, the feminists, they are more inspired by some anti-colonialist discussion in the Western feminism, so they are also supporting this minority, nationality, and indigenous people's movements. So then I will talk a bit about the direct actions, which are also happening. It's not very visible. There is map of arson attacks against the military collab centers. The collab center is where the conscript have to go in some certain day. And then they define what is fit for the army and where would the baby serve. And also when you go to the army, you go there and then they ship you somewhere. And there has been lots of attacks. And there is now different kind of radical anti-regime telegram channels. Whatever is somewhere is an accident or fire, they are claiming that this is sabotage action, which is of course not always the case. It's also possible that some of the sabotage attacks they are organized by Ukrainian special services, but probably this collapse center arson attacks, they are not so likely to be organized by Ukrainian secret services because it's happening in very distant small places, like in the middle of Siberia or Far East, in some small cities. And also there is like so many of these collapse places, it's not like very effective to destroy them because there are thousands of them, but or if you are in the city and you don't want to go to army, it might make sense because then it makes more difficult to people who are basically sure to send you to army, they have to go to some other place and maybe the paperwork is destroyed and the computers, so it's a big disturbance. So this is basically this kind of actions that make sense mostly from point of view of local young Russians who don't support our war. But yeah, also Molotov cocktail attacks in a couple of these demonstrations. There are railway attacks. I can show some pictures. The rail transport is very important for the military means because of course lots of this military stuff is so heavy that it is dangerous even to drive it sometimes in some roads if it's not the road is not in such a good condition. So And also in the Siberia there are places you cannot really even go with highway in some times of the year. So for the transport, the railway is important, but also if you sabotage the railway, it can be really a sort of function. This was quite much happening in Belarus. And in Belarus in general, this kind of anti-war movement is much more stronger than in Russia, and it's probably even is the reason why Belarus actually didn't join the war. The Belarusian dictator, this Lukashenko, he was just kind of not too afraid. And there is now Russia tries to put some pressure to Belarus, and also there was rumors that there will be false flag attacks there. So might be that at some point, because Belarus is also the dictator, Lukashenko is completely dependent on Putin, so might be that at some point he will force him to join the war, but this has not happened. Because there was also lots of repressions and very brutal arrests against people who were suspected of this sabotage in Belarus, but it's been quite effective there. In Russia it's happening less, but might be happening more in the future. But also these direct actions, they are not only, or I would say that mostly it's not organized by anarchists. We don't know many of the sections, they haven't been claimed. There might be some pictures that some Molotov cocktail is being shown, or maybe just some news, but most of these people, we don't know who is doing them and with what motivation, but also some Nazi groups are also supporting this kind of attacks. It's more of this kind of accelerationist Nazis who just want to generate general chaos. Because like I said, there are Nazis who are supporting Ukraine in Russia, but also some Nazis who are supporting the Russian army. And then there are Nazis who are against both. So it's also to think that whatever is your position in this war, you are always in the side of the Nazis. So you cannot say that, okay, you cannot be side of Ukraine because there are Nazis in Ukraine, because in every side, even against all sides, there are some Nazis. And some Nazi group was claiming for arson attacks against these conspiracy, against these corrupt centers. And also there has been some Nazis have been arrested, but they are mostly supporting almost everyone who is arrested, suspected of doing these direct actions, but not Nazis. So there is some pictures. This was also against National Guard, which is also the riot police. It was in the far east of Russia. This was, I think, in Moscow region, a Molotov cocktail attack against the Collab Center in the night time. This was in the center of Moscow, Molotov cocktail attack against some Nazis of the riot police. And this was sabotage in the Moscow region. This was claimed by anarchists. This is called the Anarcho-Communist Fighting Organization. There was some railroad track which was only going to some military places, so there was no civilian transport in this area. And also, was some newer. This was what was happened last week and this week. There was Molotov cocktail attack in Krasnodar. This was against the FSB building. And this was another in Vladimir. The railroad sabotage action was claimed also by the fighting organization of anarcho-communists in the Vladimir area. It was used to be like insurrectionalist project called Anarchist Fighter, which was in the Onion network in the Tor. They also have a blog in the blogs, but now they call themselves fighting organization of anarchist communists, and they try to organize like these kind of actions. And then I think yesterday there was a big railroad thing in Amur. It's far inside the railroad. There was like 14 wagons went off the trails, and this whole Trans-Siberian Railroad was halted for several hours for this. And this was claimed by a group which is called Stop the Wagons, which is connected. It's also initiative which tries to organize and agitate for this kind of railroad sabotage. But it's more kind of mainstream opposition, because there are like actually people who come from this kind of quite moderate, let's go to elections or fight against election fraud, who are also now trying to support this kind of more radical protests and arson and railroad sabotage. But so, of course, it was claimed by them, cannot know for sure, maybe it was in the news and they said that, okay, this was a sabotage action, but also many of these just random accidents, they have not been claimed that this was the blame, so it can be a sabotage action. And if it was a sabotage, it's interesting because this was in the Far East. And so then some initiatives, about this. The NATO Communist Party organization I already told. There is also a group of general, there are Russian anarchists and anti-fascists who are fighting in different groups of this territorial defense in Ukraine, because many people, anarchists and anti-fascists, had to escape from Russia to Ukraine. Ukraine is basically one of the only places where you can go without visa and even sometimes without passport, because from Russia before the war, because the border was not so well controlled, which don't deport people back to Russia. There were cases, even actually like maybe 2 years ago, that they tried to deport Belarusian anarchists back to Belarus, but this was overturned in the court. So there is kind of some legal mechanisms also to defend the refugees, including anarchists and anti-fascists there. So but now of course this anarchists have to fight against the occupation, because if Russia occupies Ukraine, they will be fought. But there is also like a general Russian opposition group which has organized, called Free Russia Legion. I think like a few months ago they said that they have 400 people. Now they don't say how many they have, but in the Telegram they have 72,000 subscribers. Some of these might be Ukrainians or people abroad. But this has also some support all around Russia and also in the aggression. It's a bit unclear political motivation. There are also like prisoners of war who have joined this. But it's basically they just said, okay, we need to fight. I'm struggle against the Putin regime, but what's the alternative? They are not so clear. Also, similar initiative is called Rospartisan. It's also people who are calling for underground armed struggle. It's supported. Ilya Ponomarev, he was a kind of independent leftist deputy in the Russian State Duma. He was the only deputy who was voting against the annexation of Crimea. And now he escaped to Ukraine already many years ago, but now and was not even so much in politics, but now he returns to organize this kind of armed struggle against Kremlin. Okay, now I have to do one thing, because there is also kind of so repressions. So there has been repressions sometimes for people who do direct actions have been arrested, because many of these direct actions, they have more been not so well planned. It's just that someone just feels very strongly that has to do at least something, because the society is very atomized, and they maybe don't find any people to do actions with. But also people get imprisoned for all the kinds of bullshit like this. Alexandra Skochenko case, it's quite known, she's an artist. And she made an action that she was just in the shop replacing this price tags with some more information. So instead of there is like bread 2 euros, there is like 20 people died in Kyiv or Irpin or something right now. So this kind of small anti-war propaganda in the shop. But then some other customer called the police, and now she has been in German prison already for months. accused of spreading this fake information about the Russian army, which is up to 10 years prison sentence. This is a new law, which is just some complete random repression. So we don't know, there is no court precedents. We don't know how long prison sentence she can eventually get. But this is kind of stuff that you're going to get arrested. And right now there is at least 30 people are in German prison for anti-war activities, but this changes every week. It's more and more people who are getting arrested. So I would say then at last, it's already around 1 hour. I will just say a couple of initiatives. I'm involved. One is there has been attempts to organize campaign of energy boycott against Russia. And there is different groups around Europe who are involved in this. This is a bit controversial topic in Russia. Not all Russian activists and anti-war activists are supporting this kind of boycott. But in our group, Autonomous Action, we also don't have a kind of common position on this, but also it's not something that is so relevant even to be discussed in Russia, because it's not, you cannot kind of organize this kind of boycott in Russia, you can organize it from abroad. Also, many countries, they were quite quickly making these decisions, so in some ways governments are being so fast that this kind of campaign has not even been kind of time to organize. There is a website which is put in which has some proposals and initiatives about this boycott. But one problem is that now when Russia cannot export my gas and oil so much into pipes, they can just ship them, and there is like boycott of European countries of buying oil, for example, but there is no boycott of European ships shipping this oil to India, for example. So what happens now is that Greek tankers are going to Russia and taking this oil and taking it to some India or some other countries. So if there was a boycott also with the maritime insurances, this would be more difficult. So this is one thing maybe that different moments in different countries have to discuss, but maybe this kind of would be possible to organize. Then another initiative is currently supporting anti-war prisoners, is Anarchist Black Cross of Moscow. It's a small group. It's been around for a long time, almost 20 years. It's currently, at least in Europe, it might be even the oldest or among the most oldest Anarchist Black Cross groups. And before, it was supporting mostly anarchists and anti-authoritarians and different friends of anarchists and environmental activists, for example, who were anti-fascist, who were repressed. But now with this anti-war struggles, it's also there is a kind of new big area to support all these anti-war prisoners. And there are lots of also anti-repression initiatives in Russia right now, and also existing human rights. This human rights movement has been big already in the Soviet Union times, since maybe 60s or 70s. There has been lots of prisoner support activism in Russia, but almost no one is supporting these people who are actually doing something violent or sabotage or this kind of thing. Mostly these human rights activists, they are only supporting like non-violent and non-kind of criminal protesters. So people who are arrested now for burning these military collapse centers or throwing some Molotov cocktails, they are mostly only supported by Anarchist Black Cross Moscow or some individual people. So yeah, it's not, because of the sanctions, it's not possible to send money to Russia, but I still use PayPal and cryptocurrencies. And it has the site under autonom website, autonom.org/abc. It's the Anarchist Black Cross News. This is Russian, but it's also in English. English you can find there. And another anarchist initiative this is how to do this. It's autonomous faction. It's also 20 years old organization, and it was at some point quite wide, or relatively wide, the Libertarian Communist Federation involved with other groups all around Russia. But recent years, because of these repressions and the new situation, has changed more like a media project. Before the war, it was still possible to organize public events and lectures in Moscow, and also to publish a paper journal. But now, has been forced to have all of this, and it's becoming, at least temporarily, only online information projects. But it still has a perspective to create a federation, but this is kind of long-term plans. But currently, just try to keep activists in Russia, because also many of these opposition media, like Novaya Gazeta and like Echo Mostly radio station, had to close altogether, and then there was this Dosh Cable or internet TV channel they had to close. There was Medusa project and Novaya Gazeta which got the Nobel Prize. Recently they have also been forced to move abroad, but Autonom tries to stay in Russia to be more connected with the situation and understand what's happening. Because it's like kind of important that not everyone is migrating, but for this you kind of have to increase the security and not to recruit new people, but to keep more close thing, and it's a kind of a new situation, so we are launching a fundraising in the Fire Fund to adapt to this new situation, and also to temporarily pay one person a salary to maintain this, because it's not possible to organize any support events, it's not possible to recruit new people, but we kind of have to keep the project running until there is some sort of other solution of the situation. But yeah, this was everything as far as this introduction or lecture, so we can now have some questions or discussion. But yeah, I think I maybe, yeah. So yeah, if you have some questions, you can, or comments, you can say. Okay, nothing in here. Maybe I just stop the streaming. Also because it's difficult to have these questions and discussion while the stream is on.